Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to the latest episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. On this episode, we're diving deep into the realms of strange, early 20th century science. I'll be discussing some of the stranger, darker, crazier scientific experiments which were really on the fringe at the time, and even today are considered either wildly unethical or crazy or even dark. And for a little bit of background on this particular episode, all of the following studies and experiments were ideas that were sent to me by you listeners. However, a lot of these ideas didn't really have enough source material there to drag it on beyond maybe a 4 or 5 minute segment, so I decided to string them all together into a single standalone episode. And if you were someone who sent me an episode idea along these lines and didn't hear it in this episode, that's either because there's enough source material there that I have it planned for a full standalone episode, or it's because it kind of falls after the middle half of the 20th century, and I actually have plans to create a second episode, a follow-up to this, post like 1950s, 1960s through the present day, so it might be being reserved for that episode. So without further ado, let's get into it, and we're gonna start with the humanity. So what if I told you that for a short time throughout the 1910s and the early 1920s that the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union funded numerous studies with the goal of creating a race of human-ape hybrids who would have the intelligence of a human, the strength of an ape, and who would be able to dominate the enemy on battlefields, especially in hand-to-hand combat, and who would be able to perform the labor-intensive tasks Russia would need to perform in its agricultural and industrial sectors in order to modernize the country. You would think that's crazy, right? That's conspiracy theory, tinfoil hat stuff. But it actually happened. Both Tsarist Russia and subsequently the Soviet Union did fund research into this very topic. And this research was headed up by a famous and later controversial Russian scientist known as Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov. Now, Ivanov wasn't this like mad scientist who just started out with the idea of creating human-ape hybrids. He was actually a very successful and talented biologist who perfected the technique of artificial insemination in animals, particularly farm animals, and most famously he was known for his artificial insemination techniques on horses. And this was a fairly new science at the time that he was really one of the dominant pioneers of, and his techniques are still primarily used in horse breeding today. However, he also had a general interest in animal hybridization, which is basically where you have two animals that are genetically similar enough that they can combine and make a third animal. Like, so for example, you have like a horse and a donkey, they can make a mule, or a tiger and a lion, they can make a liger, or a zebra and a horse can make a zorse, which was one of the animals that he actually created through this artificial insemination process. And around the same time he's doing this research, people are really debating, like intensely debating, the research of Charles Darwin, since it's kind of hit the mainstream. And as we know, Charles Darwin, he's the one that brings us the ideas of natural selection and adaptation and how that eventually branches into evolution. And since this debating is kind of mainstream, the general idea is out there, well, are chimpanzees close enough to humans that you could create some kind of hybrid? And while today we know that that's genetically impossible, because even though while we do share 95% of DNA sequence and 99% of coding DNA sequences, the chromosomes don't match up. While humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, most of the great apes have 24 pairs of chromosomes. And this is critical for creating offspring, because even if you were to inject a human sperm into, let's say, a chimpanzee egg, since there's a mismatch in chromosomes, there is basically a kill signal in that egg, and if there's an extra chromosome or if one's missing, it's just going to kill the cell, therefore essentially making it impossible. But they didn't know this in the 1920s, so Ivanov, being interested in this area of science, comes up with an idea. He essentially hypothesizes that humans and great apes are close enough together that you could create a hybrid through artificial insemination, which is what he sets out to do. And in 1910, he actually presents this idea to the World Congress of Zoologists in Graz. And it seems like the Tsar is willing to fund this research and get things going. However, a couple of distractions happen, i.e. World War I and the Russian Revolution. But that doesn't stop Ivanov, so in the 1920s he writes to his new Soviet masters. At this time it would be the Lenin regime, and he essentially states that this wouldn't only be good for scientific advancement, it would also be good for propaganda purposes and for purposes of proving evolution and bringing down the Orthodox Church. Because according to the Soviets, atheism was kind of the way to go, and the Church only existed to stifle progress and hold everything back, which is kind of true to this day. The Church really only exists to sow ignorance, stifle progress, hold back science, and keep us from our true potential as a part of its everlasting money-making scheme, but I digress. So in the early 1920s, the Soviet Union, they kind of greenlight his research, and he goes to French Guiana, the colony in Africa that existed until about 1958, not to be confused with French Guiana, the department of France in South America that still exists to this day. So Ivanov, he's there in French Guiana with his son, and he sends out these guys to go capture some female chimpanzees and bring them back so he can conduct these experiments. And he's not in like a nice clean lab or anything, he's basically out there in like a shack or a tent in the middle of nowhere, because he kind of has to perform this stuff in secret, because if the locals or the French authorities or anybody caught wind of what he was doing, they probably would have booted him out of the colony. So after capturing and artificially inseminating these 3 chimpanzees, he notices 3 weeks later that the chimpanzees are menstruating, so obviously the experiment was a failure. And not really knowing the genetic factors at the time, he surmises that, well, these female chimps were under stress when they were inseminated, and a female chimp under stress is less likely to get impregnated. So he decides to change tactics. He decides, okay, instead of trying to impregnate a female chimpanzee with human sperm, how about we try to artificially inseminate human females with chimpanzee sperm? Let's see how that goes. So he plans to do this with local native girls in the area under the guise of performing a medical test. However, it's at this point where he went a little too far, because when French authorities hear about this, they shut the whole thing down. They boot him out of the colony and send his ass back to Russia. They're like, what the hell is wrong with you? However, this doesn't even stop him, because he tries to pursue this experiment for the rest of his life, thinking that this is the way to go. So in 1929, he tries the experiment again, this time using the sperm from a male orangutan. However, before the experiment can begin, his last orangutan dies, and he's never able to complete the experiment. After this, he falls under some political criticism from the Soviet government and is sent into exile. In exile, he works for the Kazakh Veterinary Zootechnical Institute, and he died of a stroke 2 years later, never being able to conduct his famous yet controversial experiment. And that's just the first amongst these crazy stories we're going to get into in this episode. So for this next story, we're going to look at the history of anesthesia and pain management during surgical procedures, and the side effects of one particularly popular local anesthetic which took the early 20th century by storm: cocaine, specifically liquid cocaine. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, while medicine was making great strides, anesthesia and pain management was still kind of in its infancy. Now we can go back to the middle of the 19th century and see morphine and other opium derivatives such as heroin, and even things like nitrous oxide, which was primarily used in dentistry in order to help with pain management. And for the most part throughout history, for a lot of surgeries, they just strapped you down and you just dealt with the pain. So there was this march towards a better local anesthetic, and in the late 1800s, cocaine becomes synthesized for the first time, and it proves to be very valuable amongst surgeons and doctors as a local numbing agent, a local anesthetic. It was said to be very good at numbing the area they were going to do surgery on without just completely knocking the patient out. However, even with this new miracle anesthetic, some patients would suffer some very dangerous side effects and reactions depending on different factors, mostly the dosage. But exactly what the side effects were and what they were at different levels of dosage was still a very very fuzzy area in the middle of the 1930s. And furthermore, there wasn't really a whole lot of scientific study going on to really dial in these symptoms and dosages and everything. However, one doctor would set out to figure this out, and his name was Edwin Caskey. So Dr. Edwin Caskey was a 34-year-old proctologist who lived in Lincoln, Nebraska. He opens his practice in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1927, and he remains an active researcher and physician throughout the rest of his life. However, that life would come to an abrupt end on November 25th, 1936. This was the date of his most famous and his final experiment with the anesthetic known as cocaine, particularly liquid cocaine. So on this particular night, he's actually at an office that he has in Omaha, Nebraska. So on this night, just hours before his death, Dr. Caskey came down to the lobby of his office building to speak with a bellboy named Jerry Thomas. The bellboy would go on to later tell police that he seemed nervous yet excited, and he proceeds to ask this bellboy for a favor. So Caskey, he sends Jerry to a nearby pharmacy with a prescription he had prepared for a sizable dose of narcotics, and he also gave the bellboy a book to be returned to the local library. So after coming back from the pharmacy, Jerry gives Caskey the order and didn't see him again until 11:30 p.m. that same evening. That's when Caskey called him to his office and showed him the various messages scrawled on the wall. He then tells this bellboy not to allow anybody to erase anything that he writes on this wall, as it's all a part of his research. He then asks Jerry to test his reflexes by hitting both of his knees with a book, and once he was satisfied, he sent the bellboy back to his desk. However, he asked him to come back in a short time later to help him tighten a rubber band around his arm, and that was the last time anybody ever saw Dr. Caskey alive. And that was because on this very night, Dr. Caskey would perform his final experiment on himself. He would inject himself with a massive dose of liquid cocaine and proceed to write down his observations on the wall as the narcotic took effect. His basic reasoning for this was that he believed that since he was a medical professional who actually studied this stuff, that he would be the best test subject because he could record and document this all in a scientific manner. And to be honest, I kind of get this. There are usually some valid reasons why a person in the medical field or somebody in the scientific field would want to experiment on themselves, but the whole experiment was kind of flawed from the beginning, particularly because he was alone and there were no controls, and he himself even described it as a quote scientific experiment with death. So it's almost midnight, he's sitting there at his desk and he injects himself with this massive dose of liquid cocaine, and when you do that, it takes an immediate effect. But despite that immediate effect, he is able to write down his observations on this wall that he's basically torn all the crap off of and has decided is going to be his blackboard. And the following are just some of the insane notes that he wrote on the wall during this insane experiment. And these are the legible ones because as he descended into this, it became less and less legible. However, this is what we have. So first is, results will be recorded in an RX book. Have a university or any medical college give you an opinion of my findings. They better be good because I am not going to repeat the experiment. I will not observe vomiting. Someone else do that. I drank 1 can of beer previous to medication. He later goes on to document some of the symptoms he's having. Among the symptoms he carefully described were speech and only tongue movable, can't understand that, movable tongue and no speech, voice okay, staggering gait preceding paralysis, eyes mildly dilated, vision excellent, partial recovery, cold help, convulsions decreased when brain functioned on thoughts, deeper the thinking, less the paralysis and convulsions. And in his final note, or it's believed to have been the final thing he wrote before it became completely illegible, all memory gone, phone numbers and addresses not clear that come, they must be there originally and are driven up by this super sensation. And then what seemed to be a final editorial on his experiment, quote, advise all inquisitive MDs to lay off this stuff. Dr. Caskey would be found in his office the next morning, dead from a massive cocaine overdose. The help that he had tried to call for never came, and despite there being instructions on how to resuscitate him nearby, and even something in his desk labeled as antidote nearby, they were never touched. and a lot of people believe that this experiment was a suicide. And while there's a lot of conjecture, especially conjecture surrounding his home life, he was going through a divorce and he had relocated and he had been going through some medical stuff himself, it was ultimately ruled as a scientific experiment gone wrong. And what makes it even worse is none of his notes that he had left during the experiment were of any use to the medical or scientific community. So sadly, his final experiment was all for nothing. However, we do tend to see that in a lot of instances of mad science or dark science or science gone wrong. The idea is there. The hypothesis may be sound, but due to certain limitations, mostly ethical, but other limitations in just the scientific method itself, these experiments are usually flawed in some way and little to no useful scientific data ever comes from them. Now, that's not true of all dark or mad science. We do see some experiments out there that go way beyond our ethics. However, they do produce a plethora of great data which we can use in whatever the science is that we're pursuing or the experiment is dabbling in. Yet we would never repeat some of those experiments due to the simple fact that they are highly unethical and usually did more damage to the test subjects than good, and sadly a lot of those test subjects were human, which actually brings us to our next story. Now, this next story is one that has been requested non-stop since I first did that MK Ultra episode and I just briefly touched on it. This is the story of Project Artichoke, and after I discuss this one real quick, I'm going to jump into Operation Midnight Climax. That was another wildly requested one right after the MK Ultra episode, and both of these experiments were kind of precursors to what ultimately led to MK Ultra in 1953, and they're really the foundational experiments of what MK Ultra ultimately became. So ultimately we will start at the beginning. So Operation Artichoke was a project developed by and enacted by the United States Central Intelligence Agency for primarily the purpose of researching methods of interrogation. So basically, what drugs or methods could we use to properly interrogate a captured spy? And then subsequently, the ultimate umbrella goal of Artichoke was to determine whether a person could involuntarily be made to perform an act of attempted assassination through drug use, hypnotism, mind control, etc., etc. So basically the idea is, let's say you're a spy for the US and you're operating in East Germany, and let's just say during your work you capture some East German spy and he's tied up in your safe house and you're going to interrogate him and ultimately flip him to your side. Maybe you're going to use some technique so he will carry out an assassination of a certain target. Artichoke was basically designed so you could capture this spy, turn him into an agent for us, interrogate him, have him assassinate your target, and then afterwards he would have total amnesia of what he just did. Or subsequently, let's say you're a spy for the US and based on like moral grounds or religious grounds or whatever, you decide that you're not going to kill enemy combatants. You know, for whatever reason your ethics don't allow you to commit murder or assassination or any of that stuff. However, using these techniques or these drugs or whatever, maybe you could like take this pill and you could commit this act against your own morality or whatever and be a hero for your country but have no memory of it the next day, so you don't have to deal with that moral dilemma. Artichoke would subsequently be the reason why you're able to do this. So it's essentially a mind control program, and an actual document from that program outlines it. It literally says, can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature such as self-preservation? Essentially, the Central Intelligence Agency's in-house and overseas experiments using LSD, hypnosis, and total isolation as forms of psychological harassment for special interrogations on human subjects. And it started out with agents being dosed with cocaine, marijuana, heroin, peyote, and mescaline, which was actually the Nazis' favorite truth serum. However, by late 1952, they would encounter their dream drug, LSD, which would carry on through Operation Climax and MK Ultra. So increasingly throughout 1952, CIA agents were unknowingly dosed with LSD like almost daily. And in one account, an agent for the CIA, he was dosed daily for 77 days straight with LSD at like random times, just to see what would happen. happen. And what happened, I can only guess, was the dude tripped balls for 72 days straight and probably thought he was going insane. And the thing is, this wasn't entirely voluntary. There wasn't like a sign-up sheet at the CIA saying, hey, who wants to participate in this program? Everybody who worked at the CIA, whether you were a secretary in the office or you're some dude out in the field, was submitted to LSD or these various other chemicals at random times. At one point, a bunch of agents, they're like sent up to a cabin in New York and they're sitting around, they're drinking coffee, and then all of a sudden they're all tripping balls. Or maybe you're just some like mundane accountant in the accounting department at the CIA. I'm sure they have one. You go to lunch, you come back from the break room, you sit down at your desk, and then you just start tripping balls because they put LSD in the water cooler. And it's kind of the reason why we have these consent forms today. You know, you participate in a scientific experiment or a psychological experiment if you're in college and you're taking like Psych 101 and you participate in one of their experiments for extra credit or whatever. You usually have to sign some consent form, and on that consent form that literally tells you what you're signing up for. Well, this didn't exist back in the 50s. So if you worked for the CIA in the 50s, you were basically a test subject, whether you knew it or not and whether you liked it or not. But ultimately, the scientific data we got out of this project was basically that the subjects who left the project were fogged with amnesia, resulting in faulty and vague memories of the experience, which led these scientists to believe that they were heading in the right direction, so they would follow up with Operation Midnight Climax. Now, Operation Midnight Climax is probably my favorite little sub-operation of MK Ultra, just because of how comical it is. And while I don't really want to make light of unethical human experimentation, this one is just chock full of dark comedy. So Midnight Climax was another one of these mind control studies. It starts in 1954 under the direction of Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Now, Dr. Gottlieb, he was a chemist who was the chief of chemical division of the Office of Technical Service of the CIA, and he bases this operation off of the results of Project Artichoke. And basically during this project, he's combining what's basically, I assume, were his two favorite interrogation techniques, i.e. mind control via chemicals plus the honeypot. And for those who don't know what the honeypot is, it's kind of one of the oldest interrogation tricks in the book. You're basically seducing an enemy agent in order to get them to divulge some information about either the mission you're on or pretty much any valuable information they can get on you. And this all basically happens during that, post-coital pillow talk. It's the whole, so what are you doing in Rome? Oh, I'm just visiting. Might assassinate a low-level official later. Oh, that's fascinating. Tell me about these troop movements over here. I'm so fascinated by that. So basically they're trying to determine whether or not an agent would speak a little more freely under the influence of drugs, sex, and alcohol. Spoiler alert, they do, which is why the honeypot is so popular. So in the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA, they had this web of safe houses around the country. Some were in San Francisco, where this experiment primarily takes place, some were in New York, etc., etc. And these safe houses were where the experiment would take place, and basically they were the size of a studio apartment. There was a mirror, it was a one-way mirror, and back there was a little room where Dr. Gottlieb would sit and he would monitor the results. And in this little back room, there would usually be a toilet that Dr. Gottlieb would sit on because, he'd be in there for hours and, a guy's gotta go. And while he was sitting on this toilet monitoring all this stuff, he was usually sipping on a dry martini the whole time, which just makes it even more comical. So in preparation for all this, the CIA would hire this network of prostitutes, and they were all on the CIA payroll, and they trained them in kind of post-coital questioning and other techniques like how to slip a drug into an agent's drink without him noticing, and specifically which agents to target and who to lure back to these safe houses. Now, pretty much all of the test subjects were operatives in-house in the CIA who were just targeted, and the ones who were targeted also kind of had a reputation within the CIA as indulging in drugs and prostitution recreationally anyway, so they figured, oh, what's the harm? So by now we basically get the gist of it. The prostitute lures the agent back to the safe house. They do their thing. She plies them with drink's got LSD in it, and then she just starts interrogating him in that kind of post-coital honeypot manner. And then you have this guy who was probably already half drunk when the prostitute lured him in there, and now he's tripping balls. He just had some great sets. So now he's divulging information, obviously. You know, he's sitting there and he's like, yeah, baby, I'm a secret agent for the CIA. I've overthrown regimes and like parachuted into war zones and stuff or whatever. Of course, it wouldn't always end there. While they're tripping balls, they basically are given subliminal messages to see if they would like commit robbery or assault or assassination or whatever. They're basically trying to see if they can brainwash him in this state. Meanwhile, Dr. Gottlieb, he's sitting back there in that little back room on that toilet, taking notes, sipping on that dry martini, probably just laughing his ass off half the time. However, despite the comedic aspects of it, there were serious ethical violations that were going on here, because Operation Midnight Climax would eventually expand, and then they would start dosing people at random in restaurants, on beaches, in bars, and not just their own agents anymore, but like regular random United States citizens as Ultra expanded. And you can basically hear about Ultra itself on that previous episode I did. Now, I did just create a quick overview of that. I didn't really dive into a lot of detail. I might do a follow-up on that someday. Right now, I just don't know when. However, if you are interested in that, go check that episode out. Shameless plug aside, I do have one more story I would like to tell. And with the Halloween season coming up, I think this would be perfectly appropriate, since this story sounds like something that came out of a B horror movie. So if there are any B movie scream queens out there, you're gonna love this one, because a lot of people believe that this following story and the scientists who performed these experiments directly influenced Mary Shelley's famous novel Frankenstein. This is the story of Giovanni Aldini and his experiments with electricity. So on January 17th, 1803, a young man named George Foster was hanged for murder at Newgate Prison in London. After his execution, his body was carried across the city to the Royal College of Surgeons, where it would be publicly dissected. And this is kind of important because during this time, you couldn't just like donate your body to science. Most people believe they had to be buried in sacred ground, unless they were criminals who were executed. Then they could be dissected for science, and this was very valuable to surgeons because in order to understand how the body worked, you basically have to dissect a body. However, in this case, the body of George would be treated a little differently. It was going to be an electrifying experience for him. So enter stage left, the infamous natural philosopher Giovanni Aldini. Now, he was the nephew of Luigi Galvani, who discovered what was called animal electricity in 1780, and for whom the field of galvanism is named. So he's a famous dude from a famous family. So with George on the slab in front of him, his assistants surround him and they begin this bizarre new experiment. Now, all the medical students and the people who are like in the theater or whatever, they're all thinking they're coming to see a routine dissection. However, Giovanni, he takes out this device and he applies it to the dead guy's face. And this is actually what the Times newspaper reported at the time. On the first application of the process to the face, the jaw of the deceased criminal began to quiver. The adjoining muscles were horribly contorted and one eye was actually opened. In the subsequent part of the process, the right hand was raised and clenched and the legs and thighs were set in motion. It looked to some spectators as if the wretched man was on the eve of being restored to life. Now, the reason why Aldini was experimenting was because he was really defending his uncle's idea of this animal electricity. As far back as the middle of the 1600s, most scientists believed that there was some kind of link between electricity and life. And we know today that even signals going from the brain to like our fingers or whatever, it's mostly electrical or like bioelectrical or whatever. And a lot of people were coming out against this idea that, hey, this is blasphemous. You shouldn't be doing this. There's no link between electricity and humans. Humans are humans and electricity is electricity. You shouldn't be screwing around with this stuff. It's the stuff of God or whatever. But what we do know that Aldini's experiments with the dead and electricity attracted considerable attention. Now, while some critics out there kind of poked fun at the idea that zapping a dead body with electricity could bring it back to life, others took this very seriously because at this time in the early 1800s, electricity was still kind of this mysterious force that we didn't really know a whole lot about. And this initial experiment goes on to influence other experiments, and in 1818 it goes on to influence Mary Shelley's famous novel Frankenstein. Now, the Shelleys were actually kind of familiar with these experiments because they kind of ran in the same social circle as the doctors who were creating and doing these experiments with electricity and the dead. And shortly after the novel is published, a Scottish chemist named Andrew carried out his own electrical experiments on the body of Matthew Clydesdale, who had been executed for murder. Now, when his body was electrified, wrote, "Every muscle in his countenance was simultaneously thrown into fearful action, rage, horror, despair, anguish, and ghastly smiles, united in their hideous expression of the murderer's face." He later goes on to report that the experiments were so gruesome that several of the spectators were forced to leave the apartment, and one gentleman actually fainted. And it kind of makes you wonder, when was performing this experiment, was he maybe thinking about that infamous novel that had just been released a few months before? Because while we know today it's mostly fantasy and science fiction or whatever, in that day and age, the idea that electricity could create life was seen as a potential fact, and they were experimenting in order to find out if you could resurrect the dead via electricity, via Frankenstein's monster. And on that note, I think that's where I will end it today. Once again, this is Mike. This is Urban Legends and Mythology, and if you like this, all I ask is that you maybe tell a friend. Word of mouth is really the primary way that this podcast grows. So I appreciate anybody and everybody who has been basically doing that, sharing it with their friends, whatever. Or subsequently, if you hated this episode or this format, give me some feedback and let me know. This is kind of different from how I normally do my episodes, so let me know what you think about it. Or if you're feeling generous, you can always click that link in the description and donate. It's as little as $1 a month up to I think $10 a month. And if you choose to do that, every dime I get from that actually goes back into improving this podcast. I swear I'm not just spending it on beer and wine. But if you do want to send me beer and wine, I will not say no to it. Just reach out to me. I'll give you my personal address. Just know that Ohio has some really weird mailing or import laws when it comes to beer and wine. So if I don't receive it, it's because the state seized it. But once again, I am kind of rambling. If you did manage to make it this far into the show, I truly do thank you, and I will see you in the next episode.